The Gagliardi fortress didn't just guard secrets, it buried them. Obsidian floors lay like dark, bottomless mirrors beneath recessed lights that felt more like watchful eyes than illumination. The security monitors lining the vaulted corridors flickered with the silent ghosts of the past. Generations of men who had built an empire on the digital edge of a knife and the absolute weight of blood. Kiana Reed moved through these silent rooms like a shadow among giants. Her maid's dress was a sharp black against the crimson pinafore, her uniform still smelling of fresh linen and quiet desperation. Her heartbeat was the only sound in the vastness of the Gagliardi legacy. She had taken the role only days ago, broke and haunted, her brother's legal bills growing like a debt that could only be paid in life. The agency had been clear. The Gagliardi estate offers a fortune. It also demands total invisibility. Don't linger, don't listen. Never touch anything that isn't made of glass or mahogany. But fate, Kiana was about to find, didn't respect the boundaries of a servant. A senior guard, a man with ink-stained knuckles and a gaze like polished steel, checked his buzzing smartphone and pointed toward the Don's private study. Please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring these stories to life.
The heavy oak doors of Valeriano Gagliardi's study didn't just close, they sealed, cutting off the distant, rhythmic vacuuming of the other maids, like a tomb being shut. Kiana Reed stood in the center of the room, her breath catching in the throat of the silence. The air here was different, colder, smelling of expensive tobacco, ancient vellum, and the sharp ozone tang of high-end surveillance hardware. She moved to the desk, her black uniform rustling softly, a ghostly sound in a room built for secrets. To anyone else, she was just the help, a girl in a red pinafore apron polishing the mahogany until it shone like a mirror. But Kiana's eyes weren't on the dust. They were on the heavy, leather-bound ledger that lay slightly askew near the hum of the Don's encrypted terminal. She began to work, her cloth moving in slow, rhythmic circles, but her mind was calculating. She needed the numbers. She needed the proof of the consigliere's ghost accounts to buy her brother's freedom from the very system the Gagliardis owned. As she reached out to straighten the book, a sudden cold prickle crawled up the back of her neck, the sensation of a gaze so heavy it felt physical. Kiana froze. She didn't turn around. Instead, she looked into the polished surface of a silver trophy sitting on the bookshelf. In the distorted reflection, the room looked vast and predatory. She scanned the crown molding, the dark corners where the shadows pooled like ink, and the high vents that hummed with filtered air. The silence of the dust was deceptive. Somewhere behind the obsidian walls or through the eye of a lens she couldn't see, someone was breathing with her. Someone wasn't watching to protect the Don. They were watching to catch the prey. Her fingers brushed the edge of the ledger, and for a heartbeat the thorny focus that usually kept her safe wavered. The desk felt like an altar, and she was the sacrifice. She forced herself to breathe, to continue the circular motion of her cloth, but the weight of the invisible observer grew. She wasn't alone in the Gagliardi fortress. The silence of dust was a lie. The house was screaming a warning she was only just starting to hear.
Valeriano Gagliardi sat in the back of his armored sedan, the city lights of Naples blurring into long, jagged streaks of neon against the rain-slicked glass. He was a man of cold discipline, his tailored black suit as sharp as his reputation. But tonight his mind was on the subtle shift in the wind. The Gagliardi Empire was built on the absolute integrity of its numbers, and lately the numbers had begun to lie. He adjusted the silver watch on his wrist, the metal cool against his skin, when the silence of the car was pierced by a sharp, demanding ping. He didn't check notifications for social pleasantries. Only 3 people had this encrypted line, and none of them used it lightly. Valeriano pulled the smartphone from his breast pocket, the screen's white glare illuminating the intricate ink that climbed his neck like a shadow. The message was from an unknown source, a ghost in his machine. There was no text, only a video file and a caption that hit him with the force of a physical blow. "She's not cleaning, she's copying your ledger." Valeriano tapped the file. The video was crisp, the high-angle perspective suggesting it had been shot from the ventilation shaft of his private study. On the screen, the black maid, Kiana, the quiet girl with the expressive eyes he had hired only days ago, wasn't polishing the mahogany. Her cloth lay forgotten as she used her own phone to snap rapid, steady photos of the Iron Crown accounts. The gray pinafore she wore looked like a splash of blood against the dark wood of his desk. The temperature in the car seemed to drop 30 degrees. Valeriano's face didn't crumple into rage. It hardened into marble. He watched the way her hands moved, not with the trembling of a common thief, but with the calculated precision of an auditor. She was looking for something specific. She was looking for the heart of his family. "Turn the car around," Valeriano said, his voice a low, terrifying rasp that made the driver's knuckles go white on the steering wheel. "Back to the estate. Now." He replayed the video, his thumb hovering over the image of Kiana's face. She looked focused, almost desperate, but Valeriano didn't see desperation. He saw a breach in his fortress. The stalker who had sent the message, Indy Sterling, had achieved her goal. She had lit a fuse inside the Gagliardi house, and Valeriano was headed home to ensure that whoever had touched his ledger would never have the chance to touch anything again. The study doors didn't open. They exploded inward. The heavy thud of wood against the marble stops echoed like a gunshot, and Kiana leaped back from the desk, her heart colliding with her ribs. Valeriano Gagliardi stood in the threshold, his silhouette framed by the harsh, cold hallway lights. He looked less like a man and more like an ancient judgment, his black coat still damp from the rain, his eyes fixed on her with a predatory, terrifying clarity. Without a word, he crossed the room in 3 long strides. He didn't grab her. He simply tossed his phone onto the desk. The video was already looping, her own face, captured in grainy high definition, reflected in the mahogany as she turned the pages of the forbidden book. "I don't keep thieves in my house, Kiana," Valeriano whispered, a sound more chilling than a shout. He reached into his waistband, the cold steel of a pistol catching the light as he set it beside the ledger. "I keep ghosts, and if you don't give me a reason to let you walk out of here, you'll become the newest one." Kiana stared at the weapon, then at the man whose neck tattoos seemed to writhe in the shadows. Her thorny resilience flared. She didn't beg, she didn't cry. Instead, she reached out and pulled the ledger toward her, flipping it open to the section she had been photographing. "I wasn't stealing your money, Don Valeriano," she said, her voice trembling but sharp. "I was looking for the money that was already gone. You're being bled dry from the inside." Valeriano's gaze narrowed, his hand hovering near the gun. "Careful. Look at the quarterly payouts for the shipping docks," Kiana commanded, pointing to a series of neat, ink-brushed entries. "Then look at the insurance overhead on the secondary page. It's a classic double-entry fraud. Your consigliere is over-reporting the losses and skimming the replacement funds into a shell company." She pulled her own phone out and swiped to a photo of a separate document she'd found in the trash. "The math doesn't settle. He's taking 7% off every shipment. He isn't just a trader, he's an amateur who thinks you're too busy with the Iron Crown to check the fine print." The silence that followed was heavy with the scent of ozone and impending violence. Valeriano leaned over the desk, his large tattooed hand tracing the numbers she had unearthed. The rage in his expression didn't vanish. It shifted. It was no longer directed at the maid in the gray apron, but at the shadow behind his throne. 7%, Valeriano repeated, the words tasting like ash. He looked at Kiana, really seeing the mind behind the expressive face for the first time. "You're an auditor." "I'm a sister who needs her brother home," she corrected. "And I know a rigged game when I see one." The heavy silence in the study was broken not by a voice, but by a low, rhythmic vibration. Valeriano's phone, still resting on the mahogany desk between the pistol and the ledger, danced across the wood. Another message had arrived. Kiana watched as Valeriano's tattooed fingers snatched the device. It was a new video, live-streamed in haunting infrared. The perspective was high and wide, showing the estate's massive wrought iron front gates. The ones Valeriano bragged were impenetrable. In the grainy, heat-mapped footage, the heavy bolts began to slide back. There was no one visible in the frame, no thermal signature of a human touch. The gates simply groaned open as if pushed by a phantom. "She's in the system," Kiana whispered, her eyes tracking the timestamp on the screen. "Indy isn't just watching us, she's ghosting the hardware." A second notification hissed onto the screen. It was a single line of text. "The Iron Crown is heavy, Valeriano. Let's see how it holds up when the doors are wide open." Suddenly, the monitors on the wall, usually displaying a grid of the mansion's sprawling grounds, began to flicker and die, one by one. The Gothic fortress was being blinded. Outside, the security sirens that should have been wailing stayed deathly silent. suppressed by a digital bypass. Valeriano's hand went to the grip of his pistol, but his eyes stayed on Kiana. He realized then that his guards were useless against a threat they couldn't see, and his consigliere was a vulture waiting for the carcass. The maid in the gray apron was the only person in the room who understood the language of the attack. The gate was opened by a remote override from the subserver in the basement, Kiana said, her mind racing through the mansion's blueprints she'd memorized while cleaning. She's not just a stalker, she's an architect. If she's opened the gates, she's inviting someone in. As if on cue, the distant, muffled sound of tires on gravel reached them, multiple vehicles, moving fast and without lights. Indy Sterling had moved from observation to execution. The silhouette of the stalker was no longer a shadow on a screen. It was a digital hand reaching into the heart of the house to tear it out. Kiana, Valeriano rasped, the urgency in his voice replacing the threat. If you want to save your brother, you start by saving this house. Tell me where we go.
The shadows in the corners of the study seemed to thicken as the overhead lights hummed, flickered, and then died, plunging the room into a suffocating darkness. Only the pale blue light of Valeriano's phone illuminated his face, turning the ink on his neck into a jagged silhouette. Then the silence was violated by a burst of static from the hidden intercom speakers in the ceiling, a sound like a blade dragging across silk. Do you remember the ghost audit of 22, Valeriano? The voice was feminine, clinical, and devoid of warmth. It was Indy Inc. Sterling. You called it a necessary pruning of the weak. I called it the day my father jumped from the 14th floor because you erased his existence from your books. Valeriano's jaw tightened, his hand gripping the edge of the mahogany desk until the wood groaned. Sterling, he breathed, the name a curse. The analyst. The analyst you discarded after I found the same rot Kiana's looking at right now, Indy's voice echoed through the house, sounding as if she were standing right behind them. You didn't want the truth then, Don Gagliardi. You wanted a scapegoat, so I became the ink you couldn't wash off. I've spent 3 years watching you build your throne on lies, waiting for the perfect moment to pull the thread. Kiana stood frozen, her eyes darting toward the speakers. She realized then that Indy wasn't just a stalker, she was the mirror image of what Kiana could become, a woman consumed by the syndicate's cold logic. The mercenaries at your bait aren't here for the money, Indy continued, her tone shifting to a chilling amusement. They're here because I promised them the decryption keys to the Gagliardi vault. But before they tear you apart, I wanted you to know that it wasn't a bullet that killed your empire. It was an entry you forgot to delete. A secondary sound began to bleed through the comms, a live feed of the mansion's foyer. The heavy thud of tactical boots and the metallic clatter of weapons being readied. Indy had turned the Gagliardi legacy into a digital open house for every wolf in the city. She's not just talking to us, Kiana whispered, grabbing Valeriano's arm. She's broadcasting our position to the team she let in. She's using the audio lag to triangulate where the guards are still standing. Valeriano looked at Kiana, the realization of Indy's ink and blood vendetta sinking in. The house wasn't just blind, it was being used as a weapon against them. He reached for his weapon, but Kiana's hand remained on his arm. The comms are a two-way street, she said, her voice a sharp tactical spark in the dark. If she's in the speakers, we can find her in the wires. The roar of a flashbang detonating in the foyer vibrated through the floorboards, a physical shockwave that rattled the fine crystal on the sideboard. Valeriano moved toward the primary exit, his pistol raised, but Kiana caught the collar of his coat, pulling him back into the shadows of the service alcove. If you go out there, you're a thermal signature on a screen, she hissed, her voice barely a breath over the sound of breaking glass. Indy has the house's master loop. She's tracking your body heat through the security sensors. You'll be dead before you reach the stairs. Valeriano's eyes flashed with a flicker of frustration, the predator trapped in his own cage. The vents are too small, he rasped, and the basement is a kill box. Not the vents, Kiana countered. She reached behind a heavy tapestry depicting a hunt, her fingers finding a recessed brass latch hidden in the wainscoting. With a sharp tug, a narrow section of the wall groaned open, revealing a vertical shaft lined with a rusted iron ladder. The original architects didn't trust the staff. They built a secondary network of silence passages. No cameras, no sensors, and the walls are lead-lined to keep the kitchen smells out of the ballroom. It'll mask our heat.
Valeriano hesitated, looking at the narrow, dark throat of the passage. It was a space designed for the invisible, a place where the Iron Crown was never meant to descend. But as the heavy rhythm of tactical boots reached the study door, he holstered his weapon and followed her into the dark. The air inside the walls was thick with the scent of cedar and a century of dust. They moved in a cramped, vertical world, the only light coming from the cracks in the floorboards above their heads. Kiana led the way, her feet finding the familiar, silent notches in the wood. Above them, they could hear the muffled shouts of the mercenaries and the frantic digital chirping of their handheld scanners. "They're directly over us," Valeriano whispered, his hand resting on the wall. He could feel the vibration of their movement. "Let them search," Kiana replied, her eyes fixed on a faint glow below. "They're looking for a boss in a study. They aren't looking for a maid in the foundations." As they descended toward the sublevels, the temperature dropped. The lead lining that once kept the house's smells at bay was now their greatest shield, scattering Indy's thermal scans into a meaningless blur of static. They were no longer targets, they were ghosts in the machine, moving through the very veins of the house to reach the one place Indy couldn't bypass, the hardwired manual override in the vault. The service passage terminated in a heavy iron grate that looked out into the sterile, reinforced silence of the Gagliardi vault. Kiana pressed her face to the slats, her breath hitching. The vault wasn't empty. Standing before the primary server rack was the consigliere, his gray suit sharp even in the emergency red glare. He wasn't hiding, he was working. He had a specialized data thief device plugged into the master port, his fingers flying across a tablet as he diverted the last of the liquid assets before the house fell. "He's not just running," Valeriano hissed into Kiana's ear, his hand tightening on the grip of his pistol. "He's cashing out the insurance." With a violent shove, Valeriano kicked the grate open. He tumbled into the vault with the grace of a falling predator, his weapon leveled before he even hit the floor. The consigliere spun around, his face draining of color, the tablet clattering against the steel floor. "Valeriano, I was trying to lock the accounts. Indy is a ghost of your own making, you coward," Valeriano interrupted, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that seemed to shake the reinforced walls. "She found the rot, but I found the hand that planted it." Kiana stepped out of the shadows, her gray apron a startling contrast to the cold blue of the server lights. She picked up the fallen tablet, her eyes scanning the scrolling lines of code. "He's not just stealing, Dawn," she said, her voice clinical. "He's triggering a data burn protocol. In 60 seconds, every record of his embezzlement and every file on your legitimate business will be encrypted and sent to a server in the Caymans. He's deleting the evidence and the empire in one go." The consigliere lunged for the tablet, his desperation outweighing his fear, but Valeriano's boot met his chest, pinning him against the cold steel of the server rack. "The final audit is here," Valeriano whispered, pressing the barrel of the gun against the man's temple. "Stop the burn, Kiana," Valeriano commanded, his eyes never leaving the traitors. Kiana sat on the floor, the tablet resting on her lap. Her thorny focus was absolute. She wasn't just a maid anymore, she was the architect of the counterstrike. She found the bypass command hidden within the double-entry log she had memorized. "I can't stop the burn," she whispered, her fingers dancing. "But I can redirect the destination. I'm sending the keys to my own encrypted drive. If you want your empire back, Valeriano, you'll have to trust me to give it to you." The consigliere let out a strangled sob as the progress bar on the tablet hit 100%. The room went silent. The burn was complete. The Gagliardi legacy now lived in a pocket of code controlled by the girl who cleaned the floors. The metallic tang of ozone in the vault was suddenly overtaken by the acrid, choking scent of burning plastic. Above them, the mansion was screaming. Indy had triggered the fire suppression systems, but instead of water, the vents were pumping in a concentrated halon gas designed to suffocate both the flames and any living thing left in the room. "The mercenaries are at the vault door," Valeriano shouted over the roar of the ventilation. He stepped over the unconscious consigliere, his silhouette a dark, jagged outline against the flickering emergency strobes. He slammed the manual override, the massive steel gears of the vault door grinding as they locked into place. "How long, Kiana?" "I'm scrubbing the local drives." Kiana's voice was strained, her eyes watering from the fumes. She was hunched over the master console, her fingers moving with a terrifying mechanical speed. "If I don't delete the internal logs, Indy will have a breadcrumb trail straight to my personal drive. I have to wipe the fine print before we move." Outside, the vault door shuddered under the impact of a thermal breach charge. The mercenaries weren't just here to capture, they were here to harvest. Valeriano took a low stance, his pistol leveled at the glowing orange line appearing around the door's perimeter. He wasn't looking at the threat, he was looking at the girl in the gray apron. "Go to 99% and cut it," Valeriano commanded as a spark showered his shoulder. "We won't make it to the subtunnels if the halon levels rise any further." Kiana didn't move. She saw the hidden enemy in the code, a secondary worm Indy had planted to mirror the deletion. If she stopped now, the evidence of her brother's innocence would be lost in the fire. She reached into the console's wiring, bypassing the software lock with a physical jumper. "Just 5 more seconds," she gasped. The screen flashed a violent, blinding white. Deletion complete. The internal servers hissed as their cooling systems failed, the hardware literally melting into a useless slurry of silicon and gold. The vault door buckled inward with a deafening roar of escaping gas and twisted metal. Valeriano opened fire, the rhythmic crack, crack, crack of his weapon providing a grim backbeat to the destruction. He grabbed Kiana by the waist, hauling her toward the narrow maintenance hatch behind the server racks. "The trail is gone," Kiana coughed, clutching the tablet to her chest like a holy relic. As they slid into the dark, damp safety of the drainage pipes, the vault behind them erupted in a secondary chemical explosion. The paper trails, the digital ghosts, and the Gagliardi legacy were all being consumed by the fire. The only thing that remained was the fine print locked in Kiana's mind, and the man who was finally learning that a crown was useless without a strategist to hold it. The morning light that filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Gagliardi penthouse was clean, cold, and entirely indifferent to the wreckage left behind at the estate. Kiana stood by the glass, no longer wearing the gray apron or the stiff black dress of a servant. She wore a silk suit the color of midnight, her hands, once stained with cleaning chemicals, now resting steadily on the smooth surface of a tablet that held the keys to a rebuilt empire. Valeriano entered the room with the measured gait of a king who had reclaimed his territory. The bandage on his shoulder was hidden beneath a charcoal blazer, but the intensity in his eyes remained. He didn't speak. He simply slid a manila folder across the marble coffee table. Kiana opened it. Inside was a certificate of release, a signed confession from a state witness who had suddenly reconsidered his testimony, and a high-resolution photo of her brother standing outside the prison gates, squinting at the sun. The weight that had occupied her chest for years finally evaporated, leaving behind a sharp, tactical clarity. "He's safe," Valeriano said, his voice a low rumble. "He's been moved to a villa in Tuscany under my protection. His record is as clean as the glass you used to polish." Kiana looked up, meeting his gaze. The hierarchy of the maid and the master had been incinerated in the vault. "And Indy Sterling?" "She's gone to ground," Valeriano replied, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "But she made one fatal mistake. She left her digital signature in the ink and blood broadcast. Now that we have your encrypted backups, we aren't just reacting anymore. We're hunting." He gestured to the chair opposite his own, the seat traditionally reserved for the consigliere. The betrayal of his old advisor had left a vacuum, one that couldn't be filled by a man with a gun. It needed a mind that could see the fraud in the fine print, and the ghost in the machine. "The city still thinks you're the maid who died in the fire," Valeriano continued, his large tattooed hand resting on the table. "They think the Gagliardi accounts were wiped. Let them think that. While they celebrate our death, you will be the brain in the shadows. You will rebuild the Iron Crown, entry by entry." Kiana didn't hesitate. She sat down, her fingers already waking the screen of the tablet. She wasn't a girl fixing a mistake anymore. She was the architect of a new order. The shadow behind the throne was no longer a threat. It was her. "Let's start with the North Dock logistics," Kiana said, her voice steady and lethal. "I found a 3% discrepancy in the fuel tax that your consigliere missed. We're going to take it back."